studied marketing in college. A lot of people in business have either taken a marketing class or had the opportunity to study marketing in undergraduate or graduate or through some sort of certification program. Product management, rarely is taught
right.
at an undergraduate level. There's some emerging programs. Carnegie Mellon has a master's program focused on product management that's new this year. There's a couple other universities that either have certificates or things like that, but it's not generally taught at a undergraduate or graduate level. It's kind of newer as a discipline, particularly when you come to technology product management. So the concept of brand management has been around for a couple of decades, but you really haven't had technology product managers, until the last maybe 20 years or so. And I'd say even the past 5 or 10 years, it's really been when it's only finally been acknowledged much more widely as a important role. So, I'm not a historian or a sociologist, but I think if I look at those things, like we just haven't had as much time, right?
Sure.
When 15 years ago to today, I think there's been a lot of improvement, a lot of better understanding and better clarity. So I would expect 15 years from now, we'll be in a lot better shape. But, if you take a step back and look at kind of the longer timeline, it's just there's just less time and less background and resources to really help get some clarity around that role. And to your other point, I mean, yeah, we see that a lot. That's another thing that people come to us with saying, look, we know we're not aligned with the role of product management is, or, a company that maybe did a number of acquisitions and they've got 3 or 4 different product management teams, and each product management team defines the role slightly differently. So, we have some recommendations and some approaches, certainly in terms of what we at SiriusDecisions recommend for roles and responsibilities. But a lot of times before we get into that, we start with the idea of value. So before we can talk about, what activities and deliverables and responsibilities you have, we need to talk about what is the value that product management even brings. Because in some companies, like you mentioned, if they're I call it the none of the above, right? Whatever no one else wants to do, product management ends up doing, right? They may not see value. Or I was talking with a company recently where they're just now establishing the role of product management, and the company's been around for a while. So some other people in the organization are basically saying, why do we need this role? We've existed fine without it. We've grown. Why do we need this person? Why do we need this role? So really the first step is saying, well, what's the value that product management brings to the organization before we can talk about, here's what you should be responsible for, and here's the things that, we need to work together on. It's really about, well, why do we even need this function in the first place? And if you can establish the value, then you can start saying, all right, well, if we agree that this is the value we bring, then what do we need to do, and what do we need to be responsible for, or what do we need to influence in order to deliver that value to the organization?
Let's say you, Jeff, are coaching maybe another consultant or somebody who's coming in for the first time into an organization, or maybe it's somebody on the ground floor where they're starting to talk about this sort of change. And the sort of change you're talking about always seems to bump up against, at least in my experience, organizational change, which is scary for a lot of people. It's very frightening. Who are these people? They're coming in, they're judging whether or not I'm doing a good job. It's the Bobs, right? Sort of approach. What are some of the first steps you do when you start to first engage with those teams in order to start building a trusting relationship as a consultant coming in?
I think in a lot of cases where we focus on is, what is the process? So I think in many cases what we find is that people just want to jump in and start doing things. So, hey, we know that I'll just take an example, right? We know that our process to go from idea to product is broken, right? So, a typical kind of, generic example is, hey, right now a salesperson submits an idea, or they walk down the hall, or they email and they say, hey, we should do this. And some senior executive gets really excited and says, yes, we should do that. And all of a sudden everyone starts focusing on that. We start building this thing. And then maybe right before a launch or right after launch, we realize, is this is there a market for this? Did we build the right thing? Is anyone else going to buy it? Right. And they know that process is broken. And so they say, hey, we know that we need to implement a new process. Let's just go and start implementing a new process right now. And what we usually say is, look, you need to get everyone on board and you need to get the agreement to adopt a new process first, right? So it is absolutely change management, as you said, right? So there might be some people in the organization that are completely sold that the existing process is broken, but some people might think it works okay. So how do we help them make that case for change, and how do we help them kind of loosen the status quo? One of the things sometimes is being able to do some assessments. So, us coming in and saying, hey, I've worked with hundreds or thousands of other companies, and here's where you guys compare to other organizations. So yeah, you're doing some things well, but hey, here's some areas where you've got some gaps, and here's some opportunities, or here's what a best-in-class process looks like, and let's compare that to what you're doing today. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times, I think there's this a lot of times, sometimes the people that we're working kind of see the problems, they feel them, every day, and so they're on board, they're ready to just start running, and we need to say, look, we need to help you understand how it works, help you make the case for change, help everyone buy into it, and then it'll actually make the whole process go quicker. And so sometimes that is a matter of us enabling people, giving them some of our research, giving them some data points, giving them some examples or case studies that they can then use to socialize. And sometimes it's us coming in, no surprise that sometimes, you can say something as an employee, but when someone says it as a third party, people are more likely to listen to the third party. So,
right.
The fact that we can come in and offer that objective third party voice sometimes helps. Doing that directly can help that. I think once people, once we get to that point where they say, yes, we agree, we need to improve, we agree with this new approach, that first phase that's the adopt phase, right? How do we get people to adopt a new approach? Then we need to operationalize. And generally, once you can get through the adopt well, it makes the operationalize easier. Not to say that it's easy, but then there's some specific steps we can prescribe and some a way to do that. But I think that's probably where one of the biggest mistakes is people just jumping right over that adopt and going right to operationalize and not realizing, who are the other stakeholders and people who either aren't convinced of the need to change or actually have a vested interest in things not changing.
Yeah, I did like that you brought up that piece about socializing, about giving people things or helping them create artifacts or even just methods of communication to start socializing internally, because I think that's important as people are going to start to go through a change, or they're going to start changing processes or roles or even their org structure, making sure that ahead of the game, you're really explaining the why, right? And I think that's something that I've found going into organizations that have been struggling, is that there's not a clear vision. Has that been an experience you've had as well?
Yeah, I think certainly sometimes that's the case. I think in other cases it might be that, they kind of implicitly know what they want to do and why, but it's not as explicit. Mm-hmm. Or they might be looking at one specific piece of it. So for example, if we, I'll pick a different example. So let's take pricing. So a big area we see a gap in a lot of companies is pricing and packaging. Even people who are very experienced in product management may have very limited experience actually pricing a product or creating new pricing or packaging. And they might say, look, hey, the reason why we need pricing is just because we think we're too expensive in the market. Well, and they understand the need to change their pricing because of that, or maybe conversely, we know we're just priced too low in the market. How do we actually? That's probably the more common scenario. Hey, we feel like we're underpriced. We want to try and raise prices, but how do we do that without upsetting people?
Right.
And so they see that as the one benefit. Well, we say, look, that certainly if you can raise prices, you can become more profitable and generate more revenue. That's great. But there might be other benefits as well, right? Changing your packaging might make it easier for your customers to understand the value that you provide, right? The way that what we call the value metric, the way that you are valuing your product today may not align with the value that the customer receives. Maybe they have a very convoluted pricing structure. And actually, by changing their approach to pricing and packaging, it will make it easier for sales to sell it as well. So they might, see one benefit, but not realize actually all these other benefits that might come from it as well. So when you're talking about kind of making the case for change and socializing, part of it is certainly helping provide that ammunition for that discussion, but also part of it might be saying, look, hey, yeah, you'll get this one thing out of it, but there's these 4 other things that you'll get out of it too that you weren't even asking for, but can help. And that, again, that may be if I'm talking to a sales leader, the sales leader might be very resistant to having a price increase because they think, shoot, if we raise prices, it's going to be harder for us to sell. But if we go to them with take the position of, hey, we need to change our pricing structure because right now, your salespeople are taking too long. Every time they need to do a deal, they have to generate a custom quote, and it's really confusing for them to understand why the quote is created. So if we take a new approach, actually it will make it a lot easier, and you might get deals through the pipeline quicker, right? So that might be the messaging that works well for that audience versus, if you're talking to finance, it might be, well, ultimately this will help, improve revenue and improve profits.
One thing that isn't talked enough about is about what Agile means to a sales team, and how that impacts the work that they're doing and the expectations that they have about when they're going to get something, what it's going to look like, and all those things. Have you seen challenges with that as sales looked at as like, well, they're already Agile, they'll figure it out, right?
I mentioned yesterday we were doing an event with a number of clients, and one of the things we talked about was launches, right? And how do you do launches in Agile? And one of the biggest challenges we see is that product management and product development, the Scrum team, the Agile team, wants to do frequent launches, right? We do 2-week sprints and we want to launch at the end of every sprint because they believe that that's what some Scrum guru told them to do, or they just, hey, we added this feature, we fixed this bug, we might as well get it in the market. And then on the other hand, you've got marketing saying we can't keep up with this pace of launches, right? We can't do a launch announcement every 2 weeks. And sales is saying, we can't even figure out what you released a month ago, let alone last week. So it's interesting. So, I think oftentimes, so what we talk about is, you need to determine the right cadence for your launch. And that cadence needs to be determined based on a number of different factors. And it should not be the Scrum team's decision alone. One of the people in this discussion we were having from a large technology company was saying in their organization, the release manager decides when to release, and the release manager sits within engineering. And so there was a kind of collective gasp in the room. This room of product marketers and product managers were like, and it was interesting. And so, but that's common because I think a lot of Agile organizations see release as a engineering activity, and it's not. A release is customer facing. And so back to your question about sales, that's the biggest challenge we see is that sales just can't keep up with the pace that product wants to release it. Now, I will caveat this with, we're dealing with B2B companies specifically. And I think certainly if you're a smaller Agile, like SaaS company, this, and you've always been releasing frequently, it's probably not quite as much of an issue. And when you are an enterprise company, when you have, your products might be used by 10,000 users within an organization, right? This is where we see more of a challenge. But even then, I think one thing we see a lot is when we see companies that have traditionally focused on the smaller end of the market, when they go enterprise, when they go up market, this has become something they run into kind of head first. Like, hey, when we were selling to, I'll just use an example, like small creative companies, they love the fact that we release new features every week. But when we're selling to a 30,000 person financial services company, every release, needs to be guarded and gated, and they have to do security checks and blah, blah, blah. And it's just, they realize it. So a lot of what we talk about is, you can still be Agile. You can still develop in an Agile way. You can still, do your sprints and do your continuous integration and testing and things like that. But that doesn't mean that you have to, nor should you really ever be expected to release frequently. So the cadence of development doesn't necessarily need to line up with the cadence of launches, and a release or a launch needs to be not just an engineering activity. And especially when you have a large direct sales team, that's I think one of the big considerations that a lot of people miss.
Yeah, I can imagine the balance there is really dependent on what the product is and what the industry is and all of those things. But I can imagine those are very interesting conversations to figure out, like, well, let's provide more value quickly. And as you're saying, sometimes sales can be like, I don't even understand the value we've got right now. So I need some time to catch up to that. I think that's a really interesting perspective that you might see in some of these organizations.
So I'll give you an interesting story. There was a company I was meeting with